All right, good evening, everybody. Here with my second album review. I first would like to apologize. I haven't been updating on the NBA Finals, but a pretty busy past week, both with working a lot and setting up a job that I'm looking to start afterwards. Having an interview for that coming up soon, so I'll certainly look to be covering the NBA Finals. I also don't rule out calling one of the next two games play by play. I know I did that with one of the Western Conference Finals games. So I may look to do that, but I am going to talk about why I'm here. It's my second time I'm reviewing an album, and I'm going along with the trend of starting with an artist's discography. But this is quite a change of pace from the first album I reviewed, which was Thank Me Later by Drake, his 2010 debut. I'm going to take it back another 13 years from there to an album that came out when I was barely a year old, Third Eye Blind's self-titled debut album, the post-grunge and power pop band that had been around since around 1993, got their way opening for bands like the Smashing Pumpkins, finally got a record deal in the mid-1990s with Elektra Records, and their frontman Stephen Jenkins, who was still active with the band today, is the most instrumental part of this album. He's certainly the most visible and musical member that you hear and listen to throughout this album. And I would like to say as a preface, this is actually one of the first albums I ever purchased myself. I remember I was like 10 years old, go back to actually around when it was like 10 years after the album came out, when I was really starting to like develop my own taste in music. And I had a huge interest in music from the 1990s. And this was one of those albums that kind of kicked that off. And I'm not at all trying to make the claim that this is one of the superior albums of the decade, a decade that has so many amazing works of music in so many different genres. But the reason why I'm taking a look at this album today is because it's part of a genre that not only isn't very critically well received, it's also commercially pretty forgotten at this point in time, despite how popular this kind of music once was. And while it's kind of hard for me to personally remember just looking at the performance of some of these songs on the charts, the mid to late 1990s were a great era for bands like Third Eye Blind and like other contemporaries of theirs, most notably a band like Matchbox 20, who made very similar music, kind of adult-oriented, alternative rock, power pop, post-grunge, a lot of that coming in the wake of the grunge era that had really ended with Kurt Cobain's death for the most part. So this album really interesting in a lot of those ways, because you could certainly hear a lot of the influences of both the music that was coming out around the same time and perhaps the more intricate and unique parts of what made Third Eye Blind different. And I'm not trying to make this review comparing them to all of their bands that are contemporaries. I'm not just going to make this a Third Eye Blind versus Eve 6 or versus Matchbox 20 kind of thing. I obviously want to look at the album for what it is, but I do think it's worth noting that within this genre, this album did a lot of things that not only hadn't been seen up until that point, but really weren't manifested afterwards in as effective of a fashion, which I think is really impressive. So, listening to this album, which I've done so many times, listened to it again, of course, recently before reviewing this, and it opens up with the track Losing a Whole Year, one of the singles from the album. And I think the lyrical content throughout the album is what really allows this to flow as well as it does, along with the fact that it's bringing more personal and lyrical depth than a lot of songs in the genre were, and more specifically taking on a lot of different subject matters. And I feel like this is a genre like things that you hear on adult top 40 that are very typical to mainly just talk about love and stale relationships. But this album really tackles a lot of deeper concepts. And while Losing a Whole Year does talk about a relationship, it's certainly in a different context than what you hear in most songs of the genre. It's Jenkins talking about a relationship that he feels didn't really manifest itself very well when they were together, that they didn't do anything good for either of themselves, that they felt like they were losing a whole year together. With the chorus, I remember when we used to spend the whole goddamn day in bed. And that's something that I feel like some listeners could connect to, especially at that time. And then the song goes into this really catchy groove, definitely power pop flavor groove. And it's really, Stephen Jenkins has these like rap style vocals throughout it. And I think it's a really good opener for the album because it kind of sets a tone, not just on what the subject matter is, but how easy it is to listen to. It's a very catchy song to start off with. It grabs a listener in, and I think it's one of the better, probably their best opening track in retrospect, looking at their other albums, which, spoiler alert, I don't really think any of them are nearly as good as their debut. But then from there, he goes into the song Narcolepsy, which is a track that really had to grow on me after some periods of time. This is a song, the first song in the album that starts off really slow, a theme that kind of takes more precedence later on in the album. But once again, the lyrical subject matter of it is just simply a bit more deep than what you would find in a lot of other songs that are in this genre and in this time period. And while this album certainly did gain the commercial success that was very similar to a lot of what other bands were doing at that period of time, the album going 6 times platinum, despite only peaking at 26 on the Billboard 200. I can't say the word 200 apparently. But I do feel like the flow of this album, especially from the beginning, and establishing these easy to listen to songs with deeper lyrical content, assisted in both their commercial success, but also with developing kind of a cult following with fans. And the song Narcolepsy was actually written by the guitarist of Third Eye Blind at the time, who was later kicked out of the band, Kevin Cadigan. And he was just simply talking about his issues in narcolepsy and falling asleep all the time and feeling that he had a lot of mental struggles that were contributing to that. And that's certainly a subject matter that kind of takes the direction of losing a whole year where you're still kind of sticking to what is comfortable for a lot of listeners, and then going into a lot more of a deep and introspective song, including the bridge, which I really love. After a really good guitar solo and breakdown, there's a bridge where Stephen Jenkins is repeating, "How'd you like to be alone and drowning?" And it's lyrics like these to where you see a level of introspection in such an uppity and bright genre that it's a combination that's really hard to execute, but especially with how well they did it, it makes it all the more enjoyable. Because when you're listening to songs on these albums, and I think the song after this perhaps does this in the best fashion of really any song I've heard that sounds this upbeat and at the same time is able to take on something so deep and so tragic, really, in the song Semi-Charmed Life, arguably their best known song and their biggest hit. This is a song that is extremely upbeat, extremely happy sounding, major chords throughout, but the song is about crystal meth addiction and the depths within it. And you look at the verses, and that's really what he's going into, starting off with, "I'm packed and I'm holding, I'm smiling, she's living, she's golden, she lives for me, says she lives for me," and talking about, of course, crystal meth. And while Stephen Jenkins, I don't really think is speaking from a personal point of view in a lot of these songs, I think the level into which he's able to depict these images about such complex and very deep topics makes it all the more impressive, is that you're not really listening to this personal take, you're listening to this depiction, almost like a movie in the form of music, just what he is depicting these ideas to be. And I think Semi-Charmed Life is an incredible song in the sense that it really does tackle the issue of addiction head on, in the depths of it and the problems it gives you with relationships, while becoming such a pop song. And I don't really think we've seen too many songs like that in music in general since then. And then I think he follows up with that really well with the song Jumper, which is, of course, talking about suicide and consoling a friend who's really depressed, and that, you don't want to see him go, and that if you do not want to see me again, I would understand, is how he closes the chorus to that song. And Jumper is, of course, one of their better known songs, and I think one that does an incredibly great job, but once again, at being able to have a very easy to listen to melody, something that is easy to tune into, but then after a while you're like, wow, like this is very cohesive, it's deep, it's real. And I feel like that level of introspection in music that you're used to just turning on the radio and driving with the windows down to makes it something that is certainly worth mentioning. The next track on the album, Graduate, just kind of talk is perhaps the most angsty, I should say, the most angsty track on the album, where he's simply talking about wanting to move on to a different stage of life, not necessarily talking about graduation per se, but just being angry with being stuck in a monotonous part of life and wanting to move on. I think it's an okay track, but probably the first one on the album that didn't really hit me as much. It's pretty repetitive. It's very urgent. One of the more harder hitting tracks on the album, and I certainly think helps set the mood after Semi-Charmed Life and Jumper, which were very uppity and easier to listen to. This song, not to say that it isn't catchy, which it is, especially the guitar hook that is extremely captivating. But this song does help kind of set the pace for the next part of the album. And that's where it starts to slow down with their 6-track How's It Going to Be, which I definitely think is another strong point on the album and another one of the hit singles that they released. And this one, once again, is a bit more deeper and introspective. This one goes more in depth, talking about Jenkins' relationships and having a burnout from a relationship that he's currently in, not really caring how the breakup's going to go, just kind of having a lack of apathy about his love life. And I really think the instrumentation in it, especially towards the end, is quite gorgeous and really helps fit the tone of the song. And I think with Jenkins screaming out the bridge and the final outro to the song really helps set the mood and puts you in that mental state of being in love, but at the same time wanting to let go and not really caring how it's all going to end up. So I really think at this point, he's really Third Eye Blind, I should say, the band. I'm talking about Jenkins because he's a primary writer for the lyrics of these songs. But I think that this really sets the tone, not just for this next part of the album, but also displays their ability to slow it down a little bit and tackle these issues with musicianship that also reflects that doesn't always have to be the power pop chords hiding these very deep and dark lyrics, that he can have it both ways too. And I think that that's something that Third Eye Blind does incredibly well on the last part of the album. The next couple of tracks after that are probably the weakest part of the album, even though I think that all the songs are catchy on there. I will say that there's not a song on this album that I don't enjoy, which I think certainly says something about about the consistency of the album, I should say. I don't think there's a song in here that's blatantly bad, but at the same time, I don't really think that there's too many tracks on here that are groundbreaking by any means and really set precedents in music. And I don't really think that that's what this album was trying to do. I just think it's executed really well. The couple of tracks after that, like Thanks a Lot, Burning Man, Good for You, and London, all cover kind of these more lyrically vague concepts. And while, like I said, they're very catchy musically, they don't really bring a lot lyrically to the table, which is kind of a letdown looking at how much lyrical depth was at the beginning of this album, from Narcolepsy to Semi-Charmed Life and Jumper, and even How's It Going to Be. Thanks a Lot, Burning Man, they're very catchy, but they don't really give that extra level of depth that makes this album more than just a power pop album. London, I think, is probably the best track of those four, the 7 through 10, where he's talking about him being in a relationship and her wanting to move to London, him not wanting her to go there. Pretty self-explanatory. And it also has a very urgent and jamming hook to it throughout. So that song was really enjoyable. But to me, what really made this album extra enjoyable were the last couple of tracks on there, last few tracks, I should say. I Want You, the background motorcycle drive-by, and God of Wine close this album in an incredible way because he sets a completely different tone for the rest of the album and really makes it a lot more mellow, musically mellow, I should say, and definitely takes on more personally introspective topics while letting the music reflect that a lot more, kind of taking on the pace that was set from How's It Going to Be. I Want You is the bona fide love song of the album, where it has this very beautiful, almost like bossa nova sounding beat to start with an acoustic guitar. And the vocals by Stephen Jenkins on that song specifically are probably among the best that he has on the album, and is a very good kind of like dreamy psychedelic feel to it, which I really enjoy. And I think it really fits the era well. And I think it's one of the album cuts on the album that aged very well. The background is probably my least favorite of the last four tracks, just because I don't think it flows as well musically with the other slow songs that it is surrounded by. But I also think that it's a song that is very strong and kind of showcases their lyrical ability going beyond writing about the same kind of stuff in more lyrically shallow content, which was often seen by their contemporaries in that time. But I do think that the last two tracks in this album are probably the best two on the entire record. I think Motorcycle Drive-By is actually probably their best song overall. The song that starts off with this acoustic guitar riff and then Stephen Jenkins going in length about this very troubled relationship that has gone on for a very long time. And then once, the drums and the electric guitar pick up later in the song, it really puts you in the mood of not just angst, but confusion, sadness, all while having these very powerfully sung lyrics that I really think kind of show what this album was and what it was capable of. And I think that's kind of the apex of what Third Eye Blind was doing. And I think the last song, God of Wine, also executes that very well. Once again, I think in this song he was talking about his mother specifically and his relationship with her and wanting to spend more time with her. And then the guitar solo, which just beautifully transitions into the rest of the song in the chorus where he's repeating, I can't keep it all together. It's just really one of the emotional high points of the album. And I think that to me is what is the most impressive thing about this record, is that for something that is, as I've said, so upbeat and so easy to listen to and so catchy, it's also very introspective. It's very emotional. It's something that you could really get your head into. There's a lot of subjects that are explored on this album and that you can really dig into and relate to on some level. And what I think is even more impressive about it is that it wasn't even explicitly a personal memoir per se, that a lot of this was merely lyricism depicting these issues, perhaps most impressively in Semi-Charmed Life, the song about crystal meth addiction, but also seen in some of the later songs in the album. Of course, How's It Going to Be with the Lovesick relationship song, Motorcycle Drive-By, and of course, the Tale to His Mother, God of Wine at the end. And I think the closing tracks of this album are really, really strong. And while it did lose its footing in the middle, where lyrically the content matter was a little vague, there were some of these stretched out metaphors, it may have been hard to understand at times, but I think that that's also closed really well with the last half of the album. So overall, I don't think that this album is musically groundbreaking by any means, but I do think it deserves a great amount of recognition for being an album that, in a genre that, at least in popular music, was pretty short-lived and only saw its window of 3 to 4 years of mainstream success. This was probably the one album that was able to gain that mainstream success, create radio-friendly hits, but at the same time bring some really hard-hitting lyricism, all while being very technically and musically proficient throughout. I think all of the guitar riffs on here are very catchy and also fit the instrumentation and the lyrics of many of the songs on here as well. So to me, this is an album that not only I enjoyed a lot in fifth grade when I was first getting into music, but I greatly enjoy it now, especially when looking at where music has gone since, where Third Eye Blind has gone since, which in my opinion is a steep turn downhill. I think that this album ages a lot better than a lot of those late 90s albums that came out, were popular, and kind of sounded like this. I certainly think that Third Eye Blind's debut was probably the most lyrically and personally introspective and hard-hitting album of that. So that's pretty much all I got for the score. I'm going to give this one an 82 of 100. I think it's a great album. I think it's extremely easy to listen to. Like I said, I don't think it has to be groundbreaking or mind-blowing to be great. I just think it's one of the better executed albums of that period of time, and I think it's something that Third Eye Blind did incredibly well to put themselves on the scene in 1997. But thank you for tuning in. That's all I have for you.